You're listening to the Yoga Medicine Podcast. I'm your host, Tiffany Cruikshank. Our podcast brings you information and resources to enhance the therapeutic effects of your practice based on a deeper understanding of anatomy, physiology, and the integration of modern science and research with traditional practices and experiences. Join me and my co-hosts, Rachel Land and Katja Bartsch, as we dive into all things yoga, research, and wellness. The content of this podcast is not medical advice and is not meant to replace medical care. Please consult your healthcare provider to determine what is best for your unique healthcare needs.
The last one, and I said there are different models of that pyramid, so that sometimes looks different in different pyramid models. But the one that we've picked for here, the top level would be systematic reviews or meta-analyses. So we call that filtered research. Filtered does not mean that no one has looked at the research before, because we already mentioned typically in a peer-reviewed studies, other peer researchers have already looked at it. But in those filtered forms of research, systematic reviews and meta-analyses, researchers look at existing studies and then they want to answer a certain question. So one question would be, is yoga good for, or does it help with anxiety? And then what you would do in a systematic review would be, you would look at hopefully all the research that is out there. So you do an extensive literature research on all of those scientific search engines that we talked about before. And then you have a very clearly defined methodology, a very clearly defined set of criteria if you do include existing studies into your systematic review. And then you have also indicators how you're going to rate those studies. So there are certain parameters that you want to look at. And then you have a number of studies that match those quality criteria that you defined. And then you look through those existing pieces of research and you answer your question. For instance, is yoga helping with anxiety? But it's not one study, but it's typically a number of studies. And oftentimes systematic reviews specifically look at RCTs, at randomized controlled trials. And then there is one other form, which is a meta-analysis. And it's kind of the same thing, but it's still different because it's more of a methodology, because it looks at the numbers, it looks at the statistics, and it tries to compare the effects and compile the effects of existing studies. So you do look more at statistics. The one thing is oftentimes more it's qualitative sort of. So you look at the studies from that point of view, and if you specifically want to see if the statistics match, and if you can kind of like put them together in one huge number or one huge effect, you would do a meta-analysis. But both have their advantages and disadvantages. For instance, a meta-analysis, it's really hard to find studies that are heterogeneous enough that you can compare them and do one calculation for a whole bunch of studies together. Mm-hmm. But that's considered like the top of the pyramid, because you filter through research that has already been published through that very specific process that we talked about.
Yeah. And it's amazing because you can pull in even more numbers. The more, if you get to see something in one person, like those case studies, it's interesting. You get to see it, you have a practice where you see a lot of that. That's even more interesting. And then, you start to connect with other people and other study, and then you start creating a study, and then you get more studies. I mean, like now we're just getting the power of numbers to give us more information. So those, and the systematic reviews and meta-analysis often go together. Sometimes I see that a lot. I'm sure you know that, but those listening, but when we get those big collections of data, again, there's pros and cons. Like you said, are they really comparable? You could imagine if you were to take a few different randomized control trials and look at them, they're not all exactly the same. They're all going to be a little different. So there's a lot of those a lot more moving parts. But it is, I think, really nice to see. And they're filtering through this. The thing that takes a long time with these, from my understanding, is that, you really are combing through all those articles. And, a lot of times when they're doing these, if you look in the details of the article, you'll see that most of the experiments were left out. they're only including ones that apply to the criteria that they've applied. And so that's why, again, you have to dig in a little bit deeper to see what criteria are they applying. And then how does that apply to your practice or your work with yoga students, to be able to know how helpful it is. But, and you can imagine that also takes a lot of RCTs. So, you don't just get to the top of the pyramid. You don't just start there, but it all kind of feeds one into the other to some extent, usually.
That's what I just wanted to mention too. If there is a couple of systematic reviews or meta-analyses for a certain topic, it tells you something about the maturity of that field, because there have to be other studies, other RCTs that have already been done. And if the field is new, maybe you find a couple of case studies, maybe you find a cohort study, maybe you find one RCT, but that's not going to be enough for one systematic review. So once there are systematic reviews and meta-analyses, you know that there has been some research in that particular field, and that is somewhat mature, or we do already have a certain level of knowledge in that specific topic.
Yeah. And then what about like in vitro research and animal research? I usually think of that as kind of like the bottom of the pyramid. Where do you put that?
Oh,
Isn't
I would
kind
say
of
that
like
totally.
everything starts usually a lot of times.
Yeah.
Maybe.
I mean, that's like the basic research, or the foundational research for some of those things. And then also what we haven't mentioned is qualitative research. So there's other research types that are valuable too. It's just a different approach. So types of research where you do a lot of interviews, and then you code those interviews and you get hypotheses from that. Those are absolutely valuable too. So we just have to make sure that we understand that this pyramid is not going to cover all pieces and all types of research or studies. And other study types are very relevant as well, like foundational research or other types of qualitative research.
Yeah. Yeah. And for those of you watching or listening, I'll see if I can put a link to a pyramid. I mean, you can Google, what would they Google? Research pyramid, and they can probably find a bunch. They're all really similar.
Evidence pyramid of medicine would be a good.
There we go. I knew you'd have a better phrase. That's why you're here. We asked the expert. So you can pull that up there. I don't know if I'll be able to provide a link to one, but you can easily Google those there. Let's talk about digging in more closely, like, and this kind of applies, I think, to all of those different research types to some extent. What are the things that we're looking for to find a good quality study? What are those key points?
I mean, it's a little bit summary of what we already talked about. I would always start with looking where something is published. So is it peer reviewed? What's the impact factor of that journal? We already talked about that. It's a good way to start. And then what we just discovered a little bit more at length, what kind of study type are we talking about? And you may have an idea if that study design is a little bit lower or higher on the evidence pyramid, and that gives you a first indication to what you can make of that study and what you get from it and what you don't get. And that's okay. Like we just said, there are advantages and disadvantages to each of those. And then another thing that's really important, and you will have to dig into the methods for that, is what population is a study looking at. So sometimes with studies related to movement and sports science, you will, for instance, often find that that's sports students who have participated in the study because they're just a little bit easier to get into a study. But it's also important to know, has the study been done with a certain population that has a specific condition? Like you said before, a very rare disease, for instance, or very, very specific circumstances. So if you want to think about, can I apply this to my clinical practice, to my yoga teaching? Is this relevant for me? You need to understand if the study is comparable to the people you're teaching to or that you're talking about. I think that's very important to take a look at. And that's where it's really important to take a look into the details of the methods as well.
Yeah, I think it's easy to dive down so many rabbit holes. And for me, I'm always, and I know a lot of the people who study with us and listen to what we have to offer, read our articles, are often really curious people like myself. So it's easy to go down those rabbit holes, but I think the context we come back to, like, is it a population that's applicable to what you work with? And, what are the settings? What are the methods? Is it something that's interesting to you? Because there's so much research out there. I'm kind of like usually filtering through, trying to quickly find, if this is something I want to dig into more deeply. So I think that's a really interesting one too.
Yeah. And then, I mean, the number of participants obviously is always going to tell you something about the quality of a piece of research. That's kind of obvious. Where it gets a bit more tricky again, but so interesting, is like the type of intervention and what has actually been measured. And I feel like specifically with yoga research, that is where it really gets tricky, because there is not one yoga, as we know.
Mm,
So there is not, it's hard to compare studies to each other. And then sometimes you even don't really know what they did in the study, because oftentimes it's not detailed enough to be able to talk about that. It will just say, okay, a number of asanas, maybe it will give you the name of the asana even, but then still, that there's so many ways how to approach one pose or hold one pose. And so really understanding what has been looked at and what has been measured will be so important to be able to judge or evaluate if that's applicable for your application, if that's relevant for your application.
yeah, and especially for those listening, because I think everyone probably listening to this is either a student or a teacher who's very deeply invested in therapeutic outcomes from their practice. And so, you know, I think probably everyone can agree that yoga is not a cure-all. I think a lot of people, you can take people into group classes, and probably everyone or most people can benefit from that. But when we look at it really therapeutically, if we want to be specific to the individual, there's a lot to consider. And so in my experience, reading through yoga research, it's pretty rare to get the methods in there. Like, you'd be really lucky just to get asana names. And then a lot of times you run into, like what you were talking about too, is like stylized yoga, like what they'll say maybe is a Shivananda practice or transcendental meditation, it's just like, yeah, okay, that tells us a little bit of something. Again, we don't know the context. I think if you took a lot of really stressed out people and put them in any stylized yoga practice for a period of time that is maybe also sedentary, and like, and they just start moving, I think we'll see positive outcomes from that. So I think the context is interesting. And then for me, the number of participants is interesting. And I'm curious what you think about this. For me, 20 to 30 is worth looking at, but it's still really small. And like when you get over 100, that's great. Like that's a big study. And then there's obviously a lot of leeway in between there, but those are kind of like the big, I see a lot in the yoga world of like 22 or 20 or 18 or 25 participants, which is hard because half of them are control group.
Yeah,
Usually,
that's what I
hopefully.
was. It depends a little bit what kind of study type you have. If you have a control group and an experimental group and each only holds 10, that's probably a little bit limited number. If the study is done well beforehand, there has been someone who's really involved with statistics, and you will do a calculation how many people you need to have in one group, or how many people you have to have all together, so that the effect size that you're measuring is relevant. I don't want to go into the details of statistics here, but ideally, if it's a study that's well done, you will have a calculation beforehand, and that will depend on what kind of measure you're looking at. But oftentimes, typically also in manual therapy, what you have is 20 to 30 people. You definitely need to make certain statistics available at all. So with 5 to 10 people, some of the statistics you could do, they just don't work. So that's like a minimum number you need to have.
Yeah.
So the smaller studies are sometimes, you just cannot do certain things with that.
And from a non-researcher, like research is what you do for a living. So from someone who doesn't do that as their primary their primary work. Like from a layman's perspective, I think, especially when it's a subject that doesn't have a lot of research on it, I'm going to I'll look at it, right? If there's 20 or 30 people, still think it's really interesting. And obviously you want, good statistics and information. You want to be able to analyze the data and have enough numbers to do enough people to do that, which is more of your expertise. But I think, even for a small one, sometimes you'll even see studies with like 10 people, which is so small, but like, it's still interesting if no one's ever studied it before. Like that's how things get started, especially if someone can do it on a shoestring budget. That's how people start to get funding at some point for the good studies. We've got to have some of these little ones before we start to get proof of life that, we can get some funding and get there, right?
Yeah, right. And that's typically or oftentimes called a pilot study. And then there's some methodological restrictions with that, but that's how it gets started. You cannot go from 0 to 100 and have like that one initial research idea and do the perfect RCT immediately. It's just not how it works. So you do need to take those steps at some point. And that's why we have them. And that's why that's good that we have them. Yeah.
Well, and I know you and I actually first connected because we were going to do research together and then COVID happened. We had an experiment planned in Spain and then COVID happened. But I know for me, as a company that doesn't have, millions of dollars to sink into one research experiment, I think of it too, not even necessarily as a pilot study for a future study for us, but even just a pilot study for, hopefully someone else to come along and take some of these smaller studies at some point and then make something of it because, that's how it happens, right? Something's got to come to light before someone can start to make, at least that's my feeling behind it. And that's kind of my hope for the research that we'll do. I know we've been talking about, we've been in process of getting a research experiment going for years now and have had a lot of hangups, but have learned a lot along the way. But that's my goal at some point for the Yoga Medicine Research Institute is to have, to find ways, because research is so expensive and takes so much time. And, we have people like yourself in our community who do research for a living to be able to make use of that, and people who own studios or, my hope is to be able to find accessible ways to provide research so that the people like yourself who do the really high level research at some point can take it and maybe make something of it. make some big, fancy, expensive experiments from it.
Yeah. And I mean, if you have like one solid pilot study, that's always going to help you go further with that and get solid funding, because you will not get funding without having something you can offer and that you have done before. So yeah, as you mentioned, it's just the very important first steps, like with anything.
Or who knows what'll happen. Maybe we'll have someone in our community who writes grants, or I know my, let's see, what's the link here? My husband's brother's wife, her dad is like, I call him the godfather of epigenetics. He was one of the early guys at the NIH working on epigenetics. But who knows, maybe we'll have some link in to do some research, and you working under who I call the godfather of fascia, Robert Schleif. So you never know what'll happen, but I like to think even that small research is so important. And again, to kind of summarize too, like you're combing through this research. So again, a lot of times you're looking at the title and the abstract. And one thing that's quick to look at, like she said, is the number of participants, which for me doesn't totally rule it out. Again, it's in context of what they're studying. And, there's not a lot of great yoga research. So even if it's small, I might be looking further to see, is it a good study? Does it show me? One of the first things I look at yoga research is like, are they telling me the methods? Because I'm not going to waste my time looking at the whole article if I don't even know what they did, and tell me the asanas and be able to give me a little bit more information there. And then, digging into the details more and reading through it. And so, you can imagine just on one, we talked about the search at the beginning, like going into Google Scholar or PubMed for one topic, you might find a lot, or you might find a little as it relates to yoga sometimes. You might weed through by the type of research. You might weed through by how many citations there are, or by reading the titles and seeing what's most relevant. and then you get in and you start to look at some of these some of the easy things to look at, like the abstract and the number of participants, and then maybe digging more into the methods if it looks good. And again, like you said, I think really important is like, how relevant is it to the people that you work with, which is probably creating just your search, what you're searching to somewhat. But you can see how you could spend a lot of time on this. And my hope is that if you have a lot of our teachers or even students who are listening have specific areas of interest. And so, if it's something you enjoy doing or you're looking for some answers around a certain topic, hopefully that helps make it a little bit more succinct. Do you have other tips, Katja, that you want to add to that for people digging through?
I just want to say also what we talked about today, it's all new vocab. It's a new language if you're not used to going through research, but don't get too intimidated. If you look through a couple of pieces of research, you will see that some of the words you find, some of the language that's being used is reoccurring, and you will get used to that language to some degree, and you will not have to start at the most fancy point, reading the most fancy meta-analysis and not understanding a word about the statistics. So sometimes it's even nice to just start with a case study or a topic that is, or just an editorial. I sometimes start with a new topic by reading an editorial and just going from there, and to kind of not get too intimidated by it and not be afraid by that language, because a lot of it is just language, and you can get used to that and just get started with it, and try not to be overwhelmed by it all. I think that's one thing I would want to put out there too.
Yeah. And then if you are interested digging in deeper, I know I think we talked about the methods a little bit more too, but like, what other things? I know you and I before this, and I don't think we need to go into detail, but you and I before this were talking about a study on type 2 diabetes, and they had used a naturopathic approach. We'll put the link in the show notes. But I think this one was interesting because it was so vague. They didn't give any specifics on yoga. They were using like 5 different diet changes: low glycemic index and high fiber, and I think low fat. And then they did juice fasting and intermittent fasting and hydrotherapy and massage and yoga in quotes. And so it's like, what was really doing the changes here? And obviously they found good outcomes here. Was it the diet? Was it, like there's just so much. And I think it's really great to see studies like this, because it gives us hope, and a positive viewpoint of all these great therapies we have. But, in something like that, it's really hard. It's really hard to pull much from it.
It is. And if you read a study like that and you feel kind of like, okay, I don't understand what is going on here, sometimes you're right. That doesn't mean that the researchers didn't have the best at heart when they did their research, and they probably had their reasons for doing it that way. But sometimes it's just very hard to single out that one piece of information that you would have wanted. And that's okay too, but just be aware of that. There are studies that are including so many different things in one study that and there's a lot of studies out there that are like that. And sometimes it's not like this study that we talked about before, where they have like 5 diet changes and whatnot. But it's just sometimes 2 or 3 things are combined, and it sounds solid, but still, if 2 or 3 different therapy approaches are combined in the intervention group, even then it's hard to say something about a specific effect.
Yeah.
And that often happens in the movement, nutritional and manual world, I would say. You find quite a lot of studies like that, where it's hard to single out that one effect. Was it the yoga, or was it the yoga and the nutritional change, or was it just the diet change? You just can't say.
And I'm glad that you said that about the researchers too, because I mean, hats off to this, like, scientists and researchers like yourself who are out there doing the work and it's so much patience and time and precision and dedication to waiting to find this thing. Like, I have so much appreciation for people like yourself who are out there doing the research so that we can learn from it. And then we're going through and reading this article and 5 minutes, maybe we even spend an hour digging into it, what they took maybe a year to create, and it's hard because, when you're picking research and, I've only dabbled in it a little bit, but, even just from the little I've done, it's like having to choose is the hardest part. Like, there's so many decisions to be made around what you're going to be studying, obviously, but how you're studying it and how you're conducting it and how you're collecting it and how you're analyzing it. And, really the reality is we just need the more research, the better. And of course, having some quality within it, like we've talked about in this episode, is good. And I think even this one, like, again, I really appreciate the people who did this study on, it's called Effective and Integrated Naturopathy and Yoga Program on long-term glycemic control in type 2 diabetes mellitus patients, a prospective cohort study. So, I really appreciate that they put the time into this. I think it gives us positivity. And I'm assuming that the people doing the study were people who provided naturopathic treatments and wanted to provide this for their patients. Maybe I didn't dig into the specifics behind it, but, I think there's something to each study. However, if we want to be able to replicate it, which is so important, it is really hard to tell much from combined treatments within a study. So just a good example.
A good example. And we also started by talking about why it makes sense to look at research. And we mentioned that the research process isn't perfect, and it's not, but still, hopefully at the end of the day, with any study that you consume or that you dig into, your information level is going to be a little bit higher, and your level of detail that you know about a certain topic is going to increase. And even if the research process or the study isn't perfect, I still think that you can make more informed decisions. And if the information that you got from that study is that sometimes researchers think that this combination of treatment might do something, and we cannot really tell what the overall effect for one of those things was, but we can only tell what the whole package did, that's an information for your package too. So yeah, you cannot make the perfect decision by reading a number of studies, but you can make a more informed decision. And it is in flux, as we said. It's your personal knowledge is that way, but also the overall knowledge and research is that way. It's moving, and anything you read in that area is hopefully going to increase your level of knowledge.
Yeah, I love that you said that too, because I know from myself, just over the years, combing through research has taught me a lot as well. So, just getting in there and digging around, I think is a great way to learn. And then I do just want to add to that, it's really important to keep in mind. And I'm such an advocate of being proactive in our own healthcare, but it's also just really important to remember that this doesn't obviously replace medical care. The great thing about going to see a doctor or specialist is that not only do they have, hopefully keeping up on research, which is a lot of work too in any specialty, but then the background of the rest of the body that we don't have a lot of times unless you're a medical provider or unless you're a specialist in that specific area. So, just keep in mind that there's a lot more to the picture than just one research study. And there's always more to learn. I think I'd love to end on something that you and I were talking about. I think we've talked about before, and I know you were talking about before it too, is around kind of some of the takeaways around our choice of words when we're talking about research. Because I feel really strongly about this. I think it's really important as yoga teachers that we're careful about how we state things, because it's easy in the yoga world, and we see this all the time. People out there talking about, yoga for diabetes, or, yoga for this, or, here's 3 poses to cure your sciatica, or the research tells us blah, 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 blah. And I think there's a finesse and nuance to our languaging that's really important as we're talking about research, in honor of the mystery that's still there. And I know you feel this way too.
Yeah. I strongly feel this way too. Yeah. So I also feel like we need to make sure that we are mindful about our words, And we also mentioned today, you can never have the full picture, not even as a medical professional. You won't have the full picture. So speaking as if we had the full picture, because we're quoting maybe that one study or the 5 studies or the 70 studies that we read, is really a thing that I feel strongly about too. So research does suggest things, and we can draw our conclusions from that, and we can suggest stuff like that to our students or to other people. But I think we really need to be mindful of our words there, because everything is moving and it's never final. Research never sees itself as final. And I think that's really important to keep in mind.
And I think it's really cool that at this point in time, people really do love research. And it can almost be a little like clickbait, on I think with people in yoga right now, where, we just drop the word research and all of a sudden people are really interested. And so I do think we need to be, careful about how we use that. My favorite way to talk about research is, I think the term I always use is what you said is, research suggests blah, 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 and then you can go into what you're talking about. And I think it's really important to share this with the world, share the research. Great. Put it out there, but just be cautious that it's not only, is it a work in progress? The world was flat and then it was round, right? We really believed it was flat for a long time. And then we found out it was round. And the same thing with every kind of medical study you might find too, is that, things are constantly evolving, and one study doesn't mean everything. One study is not always great quality study. It doesn't always apply to the context of the individual you're working with, the group you're working with. So there's a lot of moving parts, but I think it's pretty safe to say when you're referring to a research article, even if it's, the 20-person study that doesn't really tell us a ton of information, I still think you can kind of loosely say that the research suggests, because again, it's the underpinnings of maybe the bigger studies to come, especially in an area that hasn't been studied much before. If it's a topic that doesn't have other good research on it, then talking about it, what it suggests, I think is a really good way to go about that.
Absolutely. And you will find that people respond to the way you're talking about research in such an important way. I oftentimes talk to my dad about research. He's really into movement and yoga too, and he's been cycling for ages, and he's a really active person, and he loves research, and he reads books that state research. And then oftentimes he will come to me having read a section about a certain study, and for him it's actually kind of the truth. So you will see that depending on what you read or what you hear, people may really react strongly to that because they see research as this very, very final knowledge, and they're very definitive. They're influenced by it in a big way. And that's why I think it's so important to really be mindful about talking about research. And then I sometimes start discussions with him and get started talking about it with him and trying to put some things in perspective too, and say, yeah, you're right, but also this and that. And that's just one example. Also, not only on the yoga mat or with other yoga teachers, with yoga students, you will see in your surroundings, in your family and friends, that it can be something very powerful, but it can also be abused if you want to put it that way. So we should really be mindful how we use research as a means of power or authority, and not to abuse it
as a means of power or empowerment. Right. Yes. I think suggesting it again invites people into the conversation. So for me, that's more empowering versus giving them like an ultimatum and, a dead end kind of, like that's it, end of the show. And so I love that. I love that you ended on that, this empowerment versus the power. Like we can yield that power in good or bad ways. But there is so much potential in the research. And, again, just giving my respect and thanks to all the researchers out there, which I'm sure we'll do many times over because we'll have plenty of these discussions. And I look forward to talking more about specific research, but hopefully this gives our audience a really nice nice foundation. Of course, you can take courses in understanding research and building research, and go much more in depth. But I think this gives our audience a really robust foundation and a lot of the essentials to getting started combing through research and looking at research, whether you're a yoga student or a teacher or healthcare provider, fitness instructor, whatever that might be. So I look forward to more. Thank you so much, Katja, for being here. Those of you watching or listening, is today your due date?
It's in 3 days.
Katja is with us 3 days from her due date of her second child. So I'm very grateful for her and her time to be here and share with us while she's baking. Percolating. I don't know. What do you call it? Cooking.
Cooking. I'm so well done already. So yeah,
that baby's
very
like,
cooked.
I'm so cozy in here. So many nutrients. Just let me stay. It's so warm and dark and relaxing.
I do have empathy, but also it's time to get out now.
Move on. Next. Well, I'll be thinking of you and wishing you well and looking forward to our next conversations. Thank you so much, Katja.
Looking forward to next time.
Thanks for listening to Yoga Medicine. If you like the show, please be sure to subscribe and leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you got something out of this episode, please spread the word and share it with a friend. You can find more information, articles, trainings, and classes at yogamedicine.com, or check us out on social media as Yoga Medicine. You can also email us at info@yogamedicine.com. Thank you for being a part of our Yoga Medicine community. We look forward to seeing you again. The content of this podcast is not medical advice and is not meant to replace medical care. Please consult your healthcare provider to determine what is best for your unique healthcare needs.